Test, test.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Chancellor Hall Current Affairs Club Forum on the impact of politics on the Jamaican economy. We are off to a very late start, unfortunately, doing some uh, due to some technical difficulties that were certainly beyond our control. However, we must press on with this very exciting and informative program. We have a host of presenters lined up for you, and we're sure that we're going to all learn a lot today. Our forum today will be hosted by Jovain Brown, the Deputy EAC for Chancellor Hall, and Mr. Joseph Sangster, the Current Affairs Club President. I am just here to give some greetings. I am Stephen also, the Deputy Hall Chairman for Chancellor Hall. Now we know that Chancellor Hall has a very rich heritage in both of the key areas of this forum, that is politics and the economy. We boast a rich history with many politicians, many economists hailing from this noble institution. So as I said before, I'm sure we're going to learn a lot today. I just want to welcome you all to this forum. And we're going to now introduce Mr. Jovain Brown and Mr. Joseph Sangster to carry on with the program.
All right, so good night, everyone. First off, I'd like to apologize for this night. This is due to a bit of technical difficulties from our side. But welcome one and all to Chancellor Hall's Current Affairs Club, Impact of Politics on the Economy. We have to have a robust discussion on this topic. These individuals are very experienced within the sectors of banking, within the sectors of economy, and within politics, which is the most important thing of today's seminar. So, going right along, we have the amazing host, obviously. Mr.
Getting some feedback, Jovian. All right, guys. Please excuse my fellow host as he tried to prepare himself for the rest of the forum. For those who don't know me, my name is Mr. Joseph Sangster. I'm the Current Affairs Club Chairman of Chancellor Hall, and I'd like to welcome all of you who are a part of the discussion. I see you guys making some comments in the chat section. Thank you for being here. Really appreciate the turnout. Looking forward to a very exciting and robust discussion about how politics really impacts our economy in our beautiful country, which is Jamaica. So we'll have a Q&A section after the discussion. So just lend your ears, try to learn something, and be attentive as much as possible. Thank you so very much once again for being a part of this discussion.
All right, so apologies for my own technical difficulties. So moving on right along to the start of the program, we have some very exciting panelists today, and I'd like to introduce you first to Mr. Courtney Campbell, the CEO of Victoria Mutual Group of Companies, also notably a man of Chancellor, or past Deputy Hall Chairman, and a man of Block Dynamite Chancellor Hall. So Mr. Courtney Campbell will be presenting today on some of the impact and some of his experience within the financial sector and what politics has caused and what difference we can make in order to plan for our own financial future, as well as Mr. Simon Sangster, the former Vice President of G2K, former Councillor Caretaker, Mandeville Division, and a Director of Sangster and Walter Mining, an individual who is actively involved in politics, an individual who is well versed on the impact of politics, and an individual who can contribute effectively to this very important discussion today. So Mr. Joseph, I'll ask you to, may I move? Yes, so Mr. Joseph, I'll ask you to introduce our other speakers. Your mic is muted, yeah.
All right, so following up on what my fellow host has said, we have some very exciting panelists on the forum here today. He mentioned Mr. Courtney Campbell, he mentioned Mr. Simon Sangster. The other two panelists are Mr. Wayne Chen, who is a CEO since 1981 and the director for many boards, because if I start on the boards he has been a part of and ahead of, I think it will take up a lot of time of the forum. So just to make it general and clear. Also, Mr. Leron Leng, who is a fellow chancellor, right? And he was former guild president of the UMONA campus. So big up to Mr. Leron Leng. Also, he's currently the CEO of the Toll Authority right here in Jamaica. So going into discussion, don't want to hold up anything. So Jovin, your mic is off. Your mic is off, Jovin.
Also, everybody welcome our panelists as they're added, participating in a very important discussion tonight. So, first off, just want to ask this very important question since it's a main topic of discussion tonight. Which of you persons on the panel are politically affiliated, you support a political party, and have been actively involved in the campaigning of a political party?
Well, good night. I have been actively involved in many political campaigns, and I am a proud member of the Jamaica Labour Party.
All right, so it seems that with the exception of Mr. Sangster, we have a few individuals who are bipartisan and who can contribute effectively and giving non-biased views. Not that Mr. Sangster will be giving any biased views. So, Mr. Courtney Campbell, I'd first like to start off asking you a question. Since you are one of the more senior persons on the panel, you've been involved in the financial sector for a number of years, and you've seen the impacts of multi-year elections, multi-year time periods, and would know what has happened in the past.
How are you? And good afternoon to your co-hosts and to fellow panelists, especially my friend Wayne Chen. Are you hearing me okay?
Hear you very well.
Good. So really a privilege to be on this panel sharing with the mans. Again, we were on a recent panel discussion, well, a recent presentation that I enjoyed very much. I'm glad to see my friend Wayne Chen on this one. I think Wayne was an urbanite though, weren't you, Wayne?
I was an urbanite, but I had many friends in Chancellor and many ex-Chancellorites.
You're a good man. You're a good man. So I'm not surprised that you had Chancellor friends. So it's interesting that I'm participating in this discussion because I'm neither a politician nor an economist. I'm a simple banker, which bankers are way down on the food chain, right? But what I would say is that politics has influenced economic developments in Jamaica and right across the world. So we're not unique in that respect. I think in more recent years, I would say that we have had, after a long struggle since our independence, I think it is fair to say that in recent years, the politics has positively impacted on the economy. If you think about it, if you just focus on the stock exchange as one barometer, in two recent years, 2015 and 2018, under two different political administrations, the Jamaica Stock Exchange was the top performer in the world according to Bloomberg. And I find that probably that's the one thing I'd want to emphasize in our discussion this evening, that whenever our politicians find a way to broaden the involvement in decision making and to build a coalition around certain objectives, that Jamaica tends to do better, right? Whether it has to do with, for example, the epoch that was established in 2013, the Economic Program Oversight Committee, established in 2013 under one administration, and then another administration succeeded in 2016 and maintained that same framework and allowed, our economy wasn't booming before COVID, but it certainly was much more stable and much more positive, much more hopeful than it was in the previous decade. I think it's evidence that we need to work together more. And that's what I would want to challenge our politicians to do. We have seen it also at play in our electoral system, that once the electoral commission has been allowed to work in a bipartisan way and involving people who are not directly involved in politics, that the conduct of our elections has been exemplary. And in fact, we are now providing advice to other parts of the world, in all corners of the world, how to run successful elections. In fact, based on what happened in the States recently, we could have given them advice as well. So I think that the political action influenced our two debt exchanges recently, the JDX of 2010 and the NDX of 2013. And as I said, following the 2013 NDX, we used an inclusive coalition approach, is what I call it, the EPOC, to monitor implementation of the program. And as I said, that was followed up in the 2016 to 2019 period. And as a result now, we saw the stock exchange performing well and jobs growing and unemployment reducing. We also saw Jamaica becoming the 6th best nation in terms of starting a business, according to the World Bank. So I'll share more later as we go on, but those are just some highlights that I'd want to share. At the end of the day, our debt to GDP, which peaked at about 147% in 2012, came down to under 100 as a result of this coalition approach. So politics can work for good. One would argue that the politics put us there in the first place at the 147 by not controlling budget deficits and so on. But I wanted to start out on a positive note to say at least the politicians took charge and charted a course for us to get this fixed. So I'd leave it there as my opening.
All right, that was some great information. But Mr. Chen, on to you. Quick question though. So you're somebody who is involved within the investment sector, a businessman, own multi-other businesses, director on a couple boards, and a person I believe owns multi-other stocks. So in your experience being involved for a couple of years, and you've seen different trends, different activities, what do you think are your motivators and your encouragers in terms of investing, the different periods which you have invested more, seen a loss, and what are the tractions from investing in certain periods?
All right, thanks for the question. I just want to say one thing so I don't lose the train of thought. Courtney brought up a very important point, and it was a point of EPOC. I just want to clarify and say that EPOC didn't come out of nowhere. EPOC came out of a crisis. We had a fiscal crisis in Jamaica where Jamaica was dangerously on the edge of a fiscal collapse. Jamaica had engaged for some time in different forms of social partnership and social dialogue. And EPOC is a shining example of what social dialogue and partnership can achieve in Jamaica, bringing together government, opposition, civil society, capital and labor in a unique way. And it is a very, very good example of what we can do given the shortcomings of our democratic system. And when I say the shortcomings, Jamaica inherited a Westminster system of democracy. It's interesting to note that if we were to look at all the developing countries in 1962, when Jamaica gained independence, and see how many have had unbroken democracy, 2020, it's only a small handful, including Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Costa Rica, and some may argue India as the world's largest democracy. But in the cases of India and Trinidad and Tobago had a coup. And for a few days when the democracy was disrupted. and they were only able to save it by having an amnesty for the perpetrators of the coup. And there was also a long period when India was under a state of emergency where the opposition was suppressed. So democracy is a very fragile thing. And it's the overriding theme of the discussion this evening, that how do you, as a poor, unequal, developing country, make the tough economic decisions when you are always at risk that the party in opposition will use it to make political hay and defeat tough economic decisions. And Courtney touched on it. Jamaica ran up. In fact, when we were at 147%, it was not the highest Jamaica has been at. There were times when Jamaica was flirting at around 200% of GDP. There were times when Jamaica was the third most indebted country in the world. And we were in the company of countries like Lebanon, which was going through a civil war. So to come back to your specific question about stocks and bonds, the one thing I say to young investors who are excited by the prospects of investment in a stock market, we have to be careful that we don't turn the stock market into Cayman Park and look at it as just buying and selling quickly, looking at IPOs and looking at the trend of IPOs and figuring that in the recent years, IPOs have shot through the ceiling. They're looking to double their money in a week and this sort of thing. That's all well and good, but that is not sustainable over the long period. That is gambling. If you're truly looking about investing, you look at the quality of the companies, you look at how the values are done, you kick the tires, so to speak, and you say, what are the, when you read the analysis, a lot of analysts have come out of even your hall, teasing you here. There's a lot of good people working in the Jamaican financial sector who can provide good information. It's a question of really pulling together the information and ensuring that you're not gambling, that you're truly investing. It would be invidious of me to mention individual stocks and shares, but you can see the performance over a long period of specific companies. You can look at the quality of management. You can look at the reports they present. Courtney knows of one company where we were together for a long time. He can talk about the people and his peers that have worked here and how many. So you have to go, unless you're just in for the short haul and going to be gambling, that's a different matter. But as an investor, you look at the company and what it represents. And it's, as I said, the strategic plan, the team, the vision. I would recommend that if there's a company that has a significant amount of its business in hard currency, given Jamaica's history, that is a good hedge. Because you don't at the same time want to be tied solely into a volatile market. So there are some guidelines. So that being said, you probably can read between the lines. Courtney is a little bit younger than me, but he'll remember a time, I'll tell you, that not too long ago, I probably can dig out a financial gleaner from the 1990s, when cable and wireless was 70% of the market capitalization of the Jamaican Stock Exchange.
Yep.
Nobody would believe that now, that one company, less of all, cable and wireless, could be that. But that was what it was. There was a time, I remember, in the early days of IPOs, when the government was divesting state-owned corporations, and we could have a whole night talking about why government got into so many different businesses, that they could have sold Carib Steel multiple times over. Courtney, you remember Carib Steel? There I was going through some of my documents and I found some Carib Steel shares. And over the years, you get the picture. Over the years, but at the time of the IPO, I think, as I said, they could have sold Carib Steel multiple times over. So, students understand our history, and as I say, don't look at it as a short-term thing. There's an American business magazine, Barron's, and I will always quote the ad. Barron's most famous ad was back in the 1980s. They said that people buy shares in the expectation that the price will go up. People sell shares in the expectation that the prices will go down. Two of them can't be right. We make the difference by providing you with the information that make you make your investment decision wisely. So as well-educated men, where I sit in distinguished company, you make your decisions based on reading analysts that you trust, looking at historical information and the future information, getting whatever information you can garner that gives you the edge on the man who is, or woman, who is betting on the share going down. People say thinking it's going down at some point, and people might think it's going up at some point. As I say, both can be right.
All right, Mr. You made some very excellent points right there. The comparison you made between time and the trends in what would I say, Mr. Campbell's days and your days compared to recent times. So really love that comparison. It gave some insight on a lot of things that we as a new generation did not know. So really appreciate those points that you made, Mr. Chen. Now,
And
Mr.
a
Lang, I
little
have a
history
question.
lesson.
A history lesson basically. So, Mr. Lang, your time now. I didn't mention in the introduction, and for those who do not know, Mr. Leron Leng is an economist by profession, and he has many points to give us regarding the 2008 recession and the economy of that time till now. What were the trends? What were the little things that the person who is not an economist would not realize when it comes to the economy between that time and now?
Yes, thank you, Simon, and thank you everyone for having me. I was getting very comfortable listening to Mr. Chen and Mr. Campbell there. Very important information and history they brought up. Very interesting indeed. And as you have mentioned, as they have mentioned, the Jamaican economy of recent times is something to be proud of. I think something to be that other countries are looking to as a model of good recovery, especially coming from that 2008 economic crisis. I mean, when we look at the Jamaican economy, where it's coming from, well, I mean, in the 70s, for example, politically there is an analysis for it, and economically there is an analysis for the 70s. But either way you take it, it was an interesting time. Economically, it proved not to be sustainable, the government policies that were being pursued at that particular time. And then we see where our GDP, we're coming from the 60s, was one of the top perform kind of, went into debt and somewhat of a crisis at the end of the 70s. And in the 80s, there was a rebound again. In the 90s, it basically, there was a flatline. And in the 90s, remember the significance of the FinSac dilemma that occurred. That was triggered again by a world recession and crisis there. And then in the 2000s, we found ourselves a highly indebted country, as our previous panelists would have highlighted. 2008 in particular, it was a world recession, the worst we would have seen since the Great Depression, triggered by the North American housing crisis, etc. And we were impacted. We were severely impacted. Our economy was impacted. And it was then and there that I remember Prime Minister Bruce Golding, who really took the bull by the horns and said, enough is enough. We need to make some fundamental reform and fundamental changes to how we do business as a country. And I remember that is when the first JDX, took place. And that was significant in terms of lowering our debt to GDP ratio. And that, I believe, was a significant moment in our economic and political history, because at that time it showed that one which had the political will to solve some of or what it was our major challenge at the time, which is our high debt. And it required, of course, private sector cooperation. So I think it was significant in that regard because it was the first time in a long while that we displayed not only verbally but through action that there's a political will supported by the private sector goodwill as well to do something about the situation we found ourselves in. And from there, I think we have come along in both parties because remember in 2011 we there was a change in government, and so there was another party that formed the government, and in they continued the policies of the previous government. And again, that was a very, very, very commendable move because it shows that we are putting country and Jamaica first. And those ideals, I think, is what made our economy and our politics the model which it is now. And IMF, for example, has given us commendations. The world has been giving us commendations and looking on at what we're doing. So I think it has been a good period, but and I look forward to more things that are to come.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that, Mr. Ling. Over to you now, Mr. Brown. I think Mr. Brown has a question for Mr. Simon
All
Sangster.
right, so yeah, thank you for that presentation, Mr. Ling. Really great information, and I'm happy that I'm part of this and can learn. But Mr. Sangster, as a person who is politically involved and a person who is actually well versed on economy and within that sector, I wanted to ask you specifically a politically motivated question. In that, widely considered the best era in terms of finances for the People's National Party, the 2011 to 2016 period, whilst Dr. Peter Phillips was finance minister, and considered one of the best eras for the JLP in terms of finances during 2016 2020, during Dr. Nigel Clark's era as finance minister. So I'd like you to make a comparison and basically state which one of these would be more successful in terms of the financial gains we made over that period, and taking into factor the climate that was existing during each of those time periods.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. Good afternoon, good evening, rather. Um, Let me just say that as it relates to Dr. Peter Phillips' time as Minister of Finance, I would say that he did some good and he tried to get back the economy on track. But then again, some of that mismanagement was created under their leadership. So let me not mince my words. As it relates to a comparison with Dr. Nigel Clark, he has done a number of things, in my view, that would ease the pressure on the economy, ease the pressure on businesses. And as a young businessman, somebody who has I've tried my hands at a number of different businesses, and I see the difference that a government can make in terms of forming policies and so on that would help businesses. There are a number of areas that I think we need to improve upon, right? We have the mind, we have persons, the competence to do so, right? But it's just a matter of really getting it done, right? We have did a too long on very important issues, right? We have wasted a valuable time that cannot be regained. So what we have to know is move forward, right? And at this point in time, I think the vehicle that is doing so is the government that is of the day. So far, they are doing a fantastic job. They have implemented policies that have helped businesses. Um, and they are moving in the right direction.
All right, well, thank you for that, Mr. Sangster. All right, well, thank you for that, Mr. Sangster. So you made a comparison in terms of what was expected during that time, and you think that this current path is the right one that's going forward. But the 2008 financial crisis would be considered by most to be one of the most difficult financial periods that the country has ever endured. Um, and during that time period, the Jamaica Labour Party was in charge of government. Um, I'd like to ask this question to Mr. Leng. In terms of during that time period, as in your expert advice as an economist, do you think that the JLP did an adequate job during that time period in terms of improving the economy of the country? And what could have been improved if they had not done so?
Well, at the time, it was Audley Shaw who was the Minister of Finance during that period. And I think in the initial stages, there was the strategy wasn't as, what's the word I'm looking for, as astute as one would like, because the economic signals worldwide that there is a serious recession occurring. I remember in the early days, the question proposed to the Minister of Finance about the impact he think it would have on the Jamaican economy, and as to not induce panic. His response was that it wouldn't be as significant as the experts were. But somehow that stance seemed to be the stance of the government, and that led to not they weren't as active as they should have in preventing and putting in precautionary measures to soften the impact. That's one perspective. The other perspective is what else or what could they do differently given the constraints that they faced at the time. So there are two sides to the argument. But overall, I think it was inevitable. That's my personal opinion, that the impact on our economy was inevitable, and we had to suffer some consequence as a result of it. And that's when we had to, of course, go to the IMF and engage budgetary support program and so forth. It was inevitable. So that's my perspective on it. Could they have done more? I think possibly, but then again, that is debatable given the constraints we have as a country.
All right. Would you like to say something, Mr. Chen?
I mean, I was chairman of the UDC at the October 2008. So I was in the heart of the crisis, and I'll make a few comments. Firstly, Minister Shaw's comment of the time has been taken to flog him. And while I'm not here to defend Mr. Shaw, so to speak, let us recall that he was also the Minister of Finance when the fiscal accountability legislation was passed. As somebody who was very close to what was happening, I would say this. I don't think anybody was in any, certainly not the Prime Minister and the ministers that I interacted with, were in any doubt that the fiscal crisis, the global crisis, was real and would have an impact on Jamaica. I think the statement that Minister Shaw made, and he can defend himself in some other forum, was meant to allay the fears given the fragile state the Jamaican economy was. And still having the memories of 1996 fresh in his minds, that any loss in confidence, especially in the financial sector, would have ruined the country. So, it's important that the theme that you have talking about politics and economics. One can get up and talk hard economic truths, but one can also get up and shout fire in a crowded theater. And I hate to class as an old man like me, corny. But you will recall, I'll give you what 1996 was like, I remember I was outside a branch of Central National Bank in 1996, and when I saw the lineup out there, July, when they closed the banks, I recall rumors. I recall getting a phone call from the head of one of the banks asking why did I go and withdraw money? I didn't, but a family member withdrew some money from a branch of a bank in Santa Cruz, and it caused a run on the bank. I had a tenant, a building society, and they put up a sign one Saturday because they had a staff retreat in Otrios. And people going to the branch, not understanding that it was a staff retreat, felt that that was a sure sign that the thing had failed and caused a run on the building society. I could give you many, many more stories because I saw it from ground zero. And I can tell you that in 1996, and it's easy to quarterback now with the wisdom of hindsight. But when you are in the cockpit and having to make decisions on the fly, it's a completely different story. I can tell you, when I was asked to go and chair the UDC, one of the things I sat down first and said is, how can we get as many shovel-ready projects out of the pipeline as is humanly possible? Because we realized then, even before the economy started to falter, that the state had to get involved and drive many projects to keep the economy going. So people are seized with the importance of what's happening. But Jamaica has structural issues. And as I said earlier, remember you have a government that came to office in September 2007 with a very thin mandate. The difference in popular vote between the parties after the 2007 election was, I can't recall, maybe 3,000, 4,000 votes. There were maybe 2 seats. There were people threatening to leave the ruling party and join the opposition if any harsh measures were put in place to deal with the issue in a more forthright way. The government would have fallen. So it's an important discussion we have, because the discussion really is, how much maneuvering room do you have to make rational economic decisions, objective economic decisions based purely on empirical data in a democratic society where governments are voted out, where many of the voters don't understand macroeconomic policy, where consensus has to be built around difficult decisions. Courtney touched on the Electoral Advisory Commission earlier. Jamaica has one of the best electoral advisory commissions on the planet, bar none. But it only came about after a series of crises. If we were having this discussion 10 years ago, the price of electricity and the sustainability of the electricity generation in the country would have been a top 3 or top 4 topic if we were having any discussion on economics. The country's economic state. We're not having that today because, like Epoch, you had E.S.E.T., you had the electricity sector enterprise team, which is coming together to make some hard decisions, and a negotiation with the JPS, which has a monopoly on the transmission and distribution of electricity in Jamaica, which had a 30-year license that would have allowed them not to invest $1 more in this country. So we would have just had to pay out based on a license that was not serving the consumer, was not keeping the country competitive, would have meant an unreliable and expensive supply of electricity, but we had to negotiate our way out. So political decisions, and it's not just in partisan politics. Politics is much more than that. One of the things that we have experienced in Jamaica, which we never experienced before to that degree, was policy continuity. Orbie Shaw, as Minister of Finance, enacted the fiscal accountability legislation in 2010 to address a fiscal situation that was unstable. It was going to undermine the entire country and set us back a generation. It meant what I think the current Prime Minister referred to as bitter medicine. The policy did not change when the government changed at the end of 2011, beginning of 2012. There was policy continuity. The government, Bruce Golding's government, faltered because it did not have the political capital to follow through on some of the measures. A new administration coming into office at the end of 2011 built up some political capital, and I've said it publicly. If Portia Simpson Miller was not Prime Minister, that political capital there, that trust in a government would not have been there. So different people pitched in at different times. Peter Phillips faced opposition in his own cabinet because the fiscal measures come with a political price. It's as straight as that. We have to understand the decision-making environment. And we have been blessed in Jamaica in many ways because we have had patriotic Jamaicans at the helm, whether who in government or in opposition, certainly for a particular decade. If we have made mistakes, it's not because of malintent, We have made mistakes just because we made mistakes. Right up to the end of the 1980s, there was an ideological war in the world. There were people who were convinced that a socialist path was workable. There were other people on the other side of the coin who said, no, there was a capitalist path. We don't have that ideological crisis anymore. My old socialists, and I'm not talking PNP socialists, I'm talking ideological socialists, say that Jamaica knows only who can better manage a neoliberal model, which is the truth. It's the reality. True. But the fact is that it will always be a race between dealing with the poor and the inequities in the society and growing the economy fast enough to find the dollars. Edward Siaga famously said it takes cash to care, And in many ways, he's right. We can have all the great intent in the world, but if you don't have an economy that is generating wealth or allowing people the opportunity to find, addressing the basic needs of the people, food, shelter, infrastructure, opportunities, a proper education, keeping competitive in a global economy that is now talking about the fourth industrial revolution. If we are not doing that and generating the wealth to do that, bearing in mind that our history has taught us, government don't generate wealth. The entire public sector has just over 100,000 jobs, somewhere between 100 and 115,000-ish. The workforce in Jamaica is 1.something million, so government is barely employing 10% of the people. The rest of the people have to find work in private enterprise. Private enterprise generates the jobs, it generates the surplus wealth that government can tax to build the infrastructure. Right now, we have to talk about a digital transformation of the country. It means that government has to be joined up in a way it has never done before. Government works in silos. But if you are going to digitally transform government, it's not just a matter of digitizing paper and having digital records. It is digitalizing processes. Yeah. We have more people still line up outside the tax office. Why do we have to go to a tax office to pay taxes? Why do we have to go to a tax office to renew our driver's license or our motor vehicle permit? These things have to be, of course, because it's a cost of the country. When I set up in line for 2 hours in a government office, that's 2 hours of my time wasted, or 2 hours of my bearer's time wasted, or my agent's time wasted. You
productive time.
And you see what goes. Yes. We can't talk about productivity when the rest of the world is going digital and we are still paper-based. So there are many issues facing the government today. And when I say the government, the ruling party and the opposition, because they have to work in concert to ensure that we make that transition. Otherwise, the incrementalism is not going to take us very far. The economy has contracted in the last 6 months more than it has ever done in the history of this country since Columbus landed in this island. It has never happened. In no war, in no strife, in no pandemic. And we had cholera wipe out 10% of the people in the 1850s. So we have never seen this. So we have some big decisions to make, and we have to make some big decisions to make in a way that the country itself is not destabilized. So it's a time discussion, but many topics at play. And as I say, government is going to have to work. And when I say government, not ruling party, government is going to have to work in a way it has never worked before.
Agreed.
Yes, Mr. Chen, you made some excellent points right here regarding the changes in not only the economy of our country, but how we as a people are going to need to adapt. How are we going to look forward into stabilizing our economy? How are we going to move forward in maintaining or even generating more wealth for the country? These are topics that probably need to be discussed at another point in time. And these are very serious and large topics. So I'm very happy that you mentioned that, because this is something that especially we as young persons at the university level need to think about from now, so we can spread the awareness of it and grow and make it a a national move, a national ideology, or some kind of executive mission for the country, which is the land we love. But thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
All right, so yes, Mr. Chen, I heard that you mentioned a few points. Most notably, I'd like to point out one thing that you said, that politicians, well, you didn't say this exact words, but you said that politicians aren't perfect because they have to take into account the current situation, the current environment, a lot of realities that we face and budgetary restrictions and such. So there are instances which our economy has declined, instances which our economy has suffered, but it hasn't been directly because of what the legislators have done and what the politicians have been actively involved in, because a lot of times the climate does not allow them to overinvest in that area, to give necessary infrastructural assistance to that area, and etc. But another question that was raised by a viewer of this discussion, so as you're coming on, I'm just going to question. He wanted to inquire about FinTech. So I'll ask any of the panelists to just give a brief description of FinTech and break it down in simple terms so that us non-students can understand.
I'll take that. Would you like me to take that, Jovi?
No problem, Mr. Campbell. You can take that question because it's open to all the panelists. It's open to all the panelists.
Since I was a banker at the time, so banker before, banker through the crisis, banker after the crisis. So I think FinTech
right,
was a
man,
significant
for the job.
Huh?
Your best place to comment on it, I think.
Yes. Yeah. So yes. FinTech was, I think, a product of several factors that played out in the early 1990s. First of all, you had some macroeconomic situation that was really terrible, right? What happened in 1991 is that Michael Manley-led government liberalized the economy, meaning remove foreign exchange controls, and there's a deregulation there. But the truth is that they did it, that itself was a good thing, but the context in which they did it was unhealthy because there was not good control of money supply, right? And of the Jamaican dollar money supply. And so what happened is that the foreign exchange rate flew, right? And caused high inflation. And what they did in response to the high inflation is to increase the government interest rates. So believe it or not, you young people, listen to this. In 1994, the Treasury bill rates peaked at 52%.
What?
Yes. Government borrowed from the public at 52%. So we were lending to customers, and so customers would have been paying rates of 60%, 70% to borrow. That is what was happening at the time. So you had that really tough macroeconomic situation. Because, as I said, by the deregulation of the economy, the liberalization of the FX controls, without good control of money supply, high inflation, high government interest rates, and as I said, exemplified in that 52% T-bill rate, right? And of course, the customers are borrowing at higher than that. So that's one. Secondly, you had a regulation problem in which the central bank. Hello?
I'm saying just for context. Just for context, tell them what the Treasury bill rate is now.
Well, the Treasury bill rate now is 2%, around 2%, right?
Yeah, so the kind of jump you're talking about.
Yeah. So, but I mean, before that, it was probably it was probably in the 20s, and it went up to 30s, 40s, 50s, and as I say, 52 is what it peaked at. The other issue then, so you have the macroeconomic cause. The second thing you had was a poor regulatory framework, weak regulatory framework, in which the central bank would, as inspector of the financial institutions, see weaknesses and not be able to intervene, right? They had very little authority to take early action with these institutions. So for a long time, the regulatory framework had not been updated, right? And then you had, at the time, a burgeoning of the financial sector. You have scores of banks and merchant banks and building societies, right? In the 1990s, because in a sense, everybody said, but boy, our time now, and everybody would get together with a few family and friends and establish a merchant bank and start to lend at those crazy rates. And there was weak control, because what would happen is that there would be a lot of commingling of funds, and someone who was placing a deposit with a building society then found out that some of it could be with the bank, and some of it could be with the merchant bank, some of it could be with the life insurance company. They were lending to each other, right? And lending to the directors and some of the big customers. There were no good rules around provisioning and lots of looseness in terms of the regulation, right? So you had that. And then the third cause, from my perspective, would be that some of the institutions were just poorly managed. This they can't blame on government. This they can't blame on regulation. They were just poorly managed, because other institutions in the same context, right, were able to report strong capitalization, strong profits, strong liquidity, and no problems in the same context, because they were forced to report to foreign bosses, let's say, who had more conservative posture. So the evidence is there that other financial institutions in the same market were able to thrive and to be safe and sound in the same context in which others failed. So that was the issue. So it started then with a few of these merchant banks and so on, calling upon the government for assistance, right? Because they ran out of liquidity, and the government stepped in and assisted those, and then it just had a domino effect, right? A real crisis that eventually caused the government to have to take a key decision. And the key decision was, do we allow these institutions to fail, right? Or do we bail them out by buying the bad debts that they have? And they took the latter, because Jamaica then had no deposit insurance. Remember that. There's no deposit insurance in place. That was established in about 1999, thereabouts, right? And so what the government did was to follow examples of financial sector rescue packages elsewhere in Sweden and Japan and so on, by establishing a special purpose vehicle called FinSAC, Financial Sector Adjustment Company. And that company now, government loan them money to buy the loans from the bank, with a view to then selling back selling the assets that were taken over from the banks, right, over time, to then reduce the indebtedness that would be now with FinSAC. So that is a solution that was tried in Sweden, and it worked there, and in several other financial sector crises across the world, right? And ours, in the final analysis, in terms of solving the banking problem, worked well. The only issue is that when the historians write this many decades from now, they will ask, should the banks be allowed, should the banks have been allowed to fail, because that rescue package cost probably 40% of GDP, right? So when we speak about the extent of the increased debt to GDP ratio between the 90s up to the early 2000, 2002, thereabouts, a lot of it, or most of it, can be pinned on the FinSAC crisis. Yeah, so that's what has happened. So what has come out of it? Much better regulatory framework, a much stronger framework. So when we see a strong, robust, healthy financial sector now that was able to survive 2008 and is doing well, 2008, 2009, and is doing well so far, in 2020, given COVID and so on, it is because we have our regulators and the managers of the financial sector have learned, and the banking laws and all the laws having to do with the securities companies have been updated, and the regulators are much stronger. We now have the financial Services Commission. That wasn't in place then. We now have JDIC. That wasn't in place then, right? All of these are new institutions. And so the regulation is much better. The management of the sector is much better in terms of the institutions themselves. And thirdly, the macroeconomic conditions are now much more favorable.
If you don't mind, I want to make two comments on what Tony has said.
Go ahead.
Again, just coming back to the theme about politics and the economy. In 1996, when the first financial institution at the time of Central National Bank was closed, I wrote a small paper, and it was based on an approach that had been taken to an earlier failed financial institution, and this was conveyed to the Minister of Finance. So I know that choices could have been made. The proposal at the time, Courtney, was whatever you do, do not guarantee government bailing out all depositors and not every class of financial institution.
Yeah.
I think the government should guarantee the first $100,000, everybody up to $100,000.
Yeah, yes.
That would have about over 90% of depositors in Jamaica, right then and there. I say convert all the rest of the debt. Take out the institutions just as they did, but convert all the rest of the debt into some sort of preference share that would pay, say, passbook rate of interest. And in 2 years after the government had assessed the value, consolidated to be consolidated, put away what need to put away, whatever, after a period of 2 years, pay back the preference shares or convert them to ordinary shares into a new vehicle. That was rejected. 2 years later, a top technocrat said to me I should have shouted louder. The thinking at the time, and this is where parties comes in, the thinking at the time was that there was going to be an election at some time in late 1997, and no sitting government, and the cabinet came under pressure at the time, that they could not take certain decisions that would have meant certain defeat in 1997. And that is a historical fact. And this is where, but it can be argued otherwise, because both sides of the argument, a good side argument can be made for both sides, and we can always say that this was hindsight. But I can tell you that at the time, it wasn't this or nothing else. Or we can only let the banks fail. There were stages in between, and as I say, because I know that this was one of the proposals. And it comes back again to political decision making on economic matters. I am not going to say that the government made an absolutely wrong choice and did it in a cynical way, because other countries experience financial sector meltdowns. A close colleague of mine visited Argentina during their fiscal meltdown, and she said it was eerie, separate and apart from the protests in the street and the destruction of property and whatnot. She said it was very eerie to see a very well dressed man picking through a dumpster to try to find something. Mexico, similar thing. So when I talk about context, we have to understand. I was trapped in Spanish Town when they had the gas strike. I came across a paper I'd written a couple of days ago because I was subbed on a presentation. Yes, the gas riot. I was subbed on a presentation at the Pegasus, and I was delayed because I was stuck in a riot in Spanish Town. And I sat in the car and watched bullets traded, police and gunmen firing shots. I've never seen that in my life, never before and never since. The country could have blown up. So I understand too that we can always say, sure, the politician was trying to do something in their own interest, which is always going to be the case. But as I say, a good case can also be made that if we had chosen another path, the country may well have descended into anarchy.
Yeah, I want to support you on that, if I may, because Mr. Patterson, in his book, and he told the story of one thing that influenced that decision that you're speaking about, is that apparently he was at a meeting on the North Coast. I don't know if it's an NEC meeting, right? And one delegate who was normally a quiet guy, very reserved and so on, stood up and said that, you know, if I go to the bank and can't get my money, blood is in the road, right? And he said he sat on the platform and took note of that and that apparently influenced that decision that that you mentioned there. So
Let me tell you something. I cannot recall, and I followed Jamaican politics all my life. Certainly since the 1972 campaign when Michael Manley went on the road with Better Must Come, because I was caught up in the Better Must Come. I was a schoolboy. Better Must Come, and there was another son, Maxi Romeo, who his birth was celebrated a couple of days ago. Let the Power Fall and I, and all the different
yes,
songs. Because it was a carnival.
you know that's, I haven't heard that long. Well,
So the run of direction, you remember those things?
yeah.
The matter is, no government has ever entered office in Jamaica with a blank slate to do what they need to do, nor with a good versus a bad option. It has always been least bad options. And
Yeah.
you see, and we tend to ignore history because we use history more as political talking points than as tools of analysis and understanding. At the end of the night, when the Labour Party lost power in 1972, Jamaica had enjoyed a decade of growth that we have never seen before or since. And was
Yeah.
I mean, in 1973, which was a momentum from 72, the economy grew by double digits. Jamaica
Yeah.
don't know them kind of growth. But we have to understand too that it was a time of capital intensive growth. When they built and commissioned the bauxite alumina plant at Maine in St. Elizabeth, it was the biggest of its type in the world. This is a multi-hundred billion US dollars investment in 1969. So the 1950s and 60s, when Norman Manley was premier, followed by Buster Manley and Hugh Lawson Shearer. Hugh Lawson Shearer's tenure as Jamaican Prime Minister also saw the greatest period of economic growth in the country. But it also saw a sharp rise in unemployment because much of the economic growth was capital based. Big bauxite alumina plants, big hotels, big infrastructure. But that doesn't tell the whole story. If we look behind the numbers, we will also understand that the safety valve of immigration was turned off when Jamaica became independent. If you look at it between 1948, when the Windrush landed in the UK, and 1962, and you see the masses of unemployed and Jamaicans and poor small farmers who left this country for the UK, not only the United States, just the UK alone, between 48 and 62, there was a safety valve in the country. The safety valve was closed in August 1962. And the economy, although it was growing by an average of somewhere between 5 and 10% between 62 and 72, it did not go fast enough to deal with the rising unemployment. So the level of discontent in the country in 1972 was very, very high. Not entirely the fault of the government, but circumstances led to that.
Right.
The Manley administration in the 70s, again, limited political maneuvering, maybe over exuberance in terms of rhetoric, but it was a time in the world when that path seemed like a viable path. In hindsight, it wasn't. But big decisions were made that led to the biggest economic contraction in any decade in this history, which put us back at a position in 1980 behind where we were in 1962. And there were decisions that were made by both parties that in hindsight may not have been great. In 1964, when we put on a bauxite levy, that was the last big capital investment in this country for decades. And nobody, well, I wouldn't say nobody, very few cried out in 1974 and said, breaking of contracts with big foreign investors is going to have a long-term consequence on this country. Rivera Aluminum put down a lot of steel in Magotty, St. Elizabeth to build another bauxite alumina plant. Took the OPIC money and walked away from it. Turned it into scrap metal of multi-hundred million US dollar investment that would have transformed Black River. People were buying up land in Black River because St. Elizabeth was going to become the boom parish based on the new bauxite alumina investments. That was it. But we have not sufficiently looked back and say, when you break contracts, what does it do to investor confidence? Big investor confidence. Nobody's going to put steel into Jamaica knowing that it can become political hostage. And that is just a fact. which is why years later we were struggling to find big name brand investors to come into this country. It took almost 30 years to rinse that memory out of the investors' minds. And that is just the reality. But we can't cry about the decisions that were taken at the time. And I use the bauxite levy specifically because it had support on both sides of the political spectrum, both sides of the aisle in Parliament. Because at the time, we were giving away bauxite for a price. That was ridiculous when Jamaica was the world's largest producer of bauxite alumina. We had seen the oil move from $5 a barrel, from cents a barrel to dollars a barrel based on OPEC and the cartel. People tend to forget that the International Bauxite Association was formed by Jamaica, Australia, and a few other bauxite alumina producing countries, not remembering that aluminum is one of the most common metals in the crust of the earth. But decisions were made with good intentions at the time that in hindsight cost us for generations after.
Yeah.
I don't hear anybody talking about it.
Yeah. One of the things, Javian, that we have to consider is where we are now, right? We're at the end of 2020 and we have this history since 1962 that we're less than happy with. Yeah. If you youngsters, because like my generation, we are about to kind of pass the baton to you, right? And what we would hope is that the decades ahead will be more prosperous for Jamaica, because where we are now, though we have had some stability recently, the reality is that our per capita income of $5,500 US is very low. Barbados, with all that they have gone through recently, they're about 17,000. Trinidad in the high teens as well, right? So Bahamas in the 30s, right? So the question for us is, why are we continuing to struggle so much? One book that I would recommend to you youngsters, that with respect to the economics, the more exclusive the economic control is in the country, where it is just economic power is concentrated among a few. So you will see that it's thriving, it's growing like in the 1960s, but it's never going to be sustainable if only a few people benefit from it. Never doesn't happen in any country in the world, right? You will see, and whether it is communist or capitalist, if the economic power is concentrated among a few, it's never sustainable. And the same thing with the political control, that if political control is not diffused, more diffused and shared political decision making is the greater the likelihood that the country will achieve and sustain prosperity. So the question for you youngsters is, in your time at the wicket, what are you going to do to ensure that the economic power and economic control is more widely distributed, that there is greater inclusiveness, right, across the country, and that with respect to political decision making, that more people get involved, and that when one party, for example, is elected, whatever color it is, that the rest of the country is not subjected to a dictatorship by those few. Because the reality is that the countries in the world that are able to ensure that people of whatever political persuasion have some influence, have some say, that those countries tend to do better. And they conducted extensive research across eras, across cultures, across geographies, and found that holds true. So our generation hasn't done well, because our generation has remained as divided as we were in 1962, right? We don't criticize our friends, our political friends. We don't commend those who are on the other side and give support. So Jamaica is only firing off 2 of the 4 cylinders at any one point in time. We have never fired off the 4 cylinders.
Agreed.
And that's a problem. Anytime we have found it possible to fire off 4 cylinders, we have done well.
And I want to endorse that and come back again to epoch and social dialogue. I'll tell you this: when the JDX and the NDX came about, my friends in Washington told me that Jamaica was going to fail. There was no way that Jamaica did what Jamaica agreed to do in 2012 had not been achieved by any other country in the world. I remember The Economist wrote an article and said that Greece should look to Jamaica for guidance because what Jamaica was doing and what Jamaica has done, and I say Jamaica has done, because it took all hands on deck to get it done. It took all hands on deck. We had policy continuity and
anytime we work together hand in hand, we're unbeatable.
Yeah.
This is the point.
Yeah.
And
but we find it so easy to divide ourselves in the camps, and boy, it's just doesn't make any sense. We're 2.7 million people. What's the division about?
But you know, I'll say this in Courtney and gentlemen.
Well, I think we have come far away from the days of political tribalism. I mean, back in, if you compare today as it relates to yesteryears, we have come a far away, to borrow a phrase from a former prime minister, you have to balance the books while balancing people's lives. And, that is very important. The country has grown over the last 10 years, in my opinion. Both political parties have had some continuity in their programs, and we must applaud them for that. That is the way to move forward, really, because it don't make sense that you have a good plan or a good policy there, and the next administration come in and it can work, and you throw it away. That makes no sense, So young persons need to be aware of that, and they need to be vigilant as it relates to that. That if there are policies that are left there by the previous administration, they need to be followed through once they are viable and once they are good policies. The country, as it stands now, we have to look at the junior stock exchange, for example. I mean, those are some things that were implemented some time ago by, I think it was Shaw, and that has enabled companies. I know persons personally who have been enabled to reach their financial goals, or their company has been able to reach their financial goals, and all of these things are very important to running a country, to sustaining viability as it relates to our country. So that is something that I think we have passed now as it relates to political tribalism, thank God. And history is very important, because obviously history tells you where you're coming from and where you ought not to go back to, So I think we're on the right path for now.
Good. And good. Let's keep it there. Your generation has to ensure that we keep it there.
Well, yes, we do, because it makes no sense to be fighting over things that can be, dealt in an amicable way. Gone are those days. We are too far advanced as a country, as a people, as a nation, for that to go back to those days.
Absolutely. So my perspective is that, we will have elections every 5 years. Things will never be perfect, so we'll always have things to quarrel about and to fight the election on, right? There'll always be things, a different issue. And the most prosperous countries in the world have good democracies in which the people have contending views every 4 or 5 years, however often their elections are held. But they find a way to agree on certain core things. Yes. And what we need to continue doing is to search for those other core issues on which we can agree, because it's not every issue that we'll be able to agree on. We'll always find something to fight an election on. No. But there are the key things that if we get consensus on them, Jamaica is unbeatable.
I think the important
to add here, because it hasn't gotten enough publicity. We have agreed on a crime plan, the CMOC, and the consensus was signed in August, and it's a very important plan. But whenever I look at a media report, and I'm going to knock the media here, it displays a real lack of understanding of what has happened. It's not just another crime trust, and it needs help. It needs help in the sense of public awareness and support. which leads me to the bigger point. There's no educated country on the planet that has remained poor. It's important that we inform ourselves, that we really look about educating our fellow Jamaicans. And if governments veer towards, or some future government veers towards dictatorship because they are impatient with trying to explain things, they have to wheel and come again, because it is not sustainable. At the end of the day, it is going to need an informed and educated populace to ensure that policy making is done on objective and empirical grounds. Jamaica has dodged some disasters, but it should not take another crisis for us to deal with electricity price, or having free and fair elections, or dealing with a debt spiraling out of control, or inflation spiraling out of control. And in fact, an important bill came to the House and was passed just days ago that formalized a lot of the independence for the central bank that had been fought for a long time, coming back to Courtney's point about making it a strong and independent regulator. But how much press did that get, and how much commentary did that get? In fact, I made a comment the day that I looked at the headline, and it was more about the Dog Bite Act than about important legislation that has implications for generations to come. And I'm not for 1 minute saying that dogs biting people without any sanction is not important. But it cannot be framed as legislation that formalizes the independence of the central bank, something that we argued for 25 years.
Very important. Agreed.
So media has a role to play also. Let us say that the populace is not informed, and it worries me that the quality of public discourse in the media is not leading us where we need to go when policymakers are being guided towards making decisions. I used to tease, from time to time in the past, I've been asked to introduce various government ministers of both political parties. And there was a stock introduction I used to give, especially those ministers of finance. And I would say, I want to, before I introduce a minister, I want to introduce him to an alien concept in Jamaica, which is long-term planning. And a concept that is alien in Jamaica, which is planning for the long term, and using empirical data to guide policy making and the field. And they would always laugh, but it's a serious matter. If we were to dissect and analyze policy making over the many years, the element of populism in it, in other words, crowd pleasing over using hardcore data. I'll ask a different question. How much effort and time has been spent in Jamaica on policy analysis? Have we looked long term and said, what is the economic benefit? And there are some sacred cows. If I was to ask a question today, what has been the economic benefit of the National Housing Trust over the last 44 or 45 years? If we had left that money in people's pockets, would they have built more homes? There's one economist characterized the National Housing Trust of taking from the poor to build houses for the less poor. Because 8% of the contributors to the trust will never be able to access the products of the trust.
Loans.
I'm not criticizing National Housing Trust, but what I'm saying is, know that we have hindsight. Where is the analysis to say whether we had gone on the right track in that direction? I was surprised just a couple of years ago when they were celebrating the 50th anniversary of the National Insurance Scheme to know that almost 30% of Jamaicans were still not on the National Insurance Scheme, which has been a proxy for pensions in this country. So what you're saying is that 30%, mostly poor, don't even have a guaranteed income once they pass the age of retirement. But where is the national effort? You get where I'm coming from, Courtney. We need, it's not just the education of the ordinary voter or the ordinary citizen. It's the education of the policymakers being guided again by empirical data.
All right, so well, thank you guys for those perspectives and that information. So another question from me. You touch on a multitude of topics, Mr. Chen and Mr. Campbell and Sangstein, etc. But one thing that you particularly stated on was the impact of the government decision makers and the different factors that can influence their decisions. So most recent example, which a lot of people think the government has prioritized economy over other long-term decisions and long-term benefits, the decision to mine at Portobello, and a lot of criticism has arisen because of that, because the thought is that they aim to protect the economy as opposed to climate change and what is important long term. So more short term gain as opposed to long term gain. So I want to hear a multitude of perspectives. I'd like to start with Mr. Chancellor, seeing that you're actively involved in the JLP. So I'd like to see your perspective of the other panelists.
Well, I'll give you better than that. I am in the quarry business itself and construction. So that speaks to the heart of what I do. In my view, I would say that there needs to be a balance. In everything you do in life, there needs to be a balance, right? But from my personal observation and my personal experience is that sometimes these agencies need to be a little bit more inclusive. That is number one, in terms of when they're making their decisions and how they go about it. And I am speaking from experience because I've had a number of run-ins with various environmental persons and so on. So sometimes I think it's really a matter of everybody sitting down at a table. There needs to be proper dialogue sometime in various instances, right? And that will get rid of some of the misconceptions that are out there, right? But the reality is that you have to come back to trying to balance the books, right? You have to balance the books with balancing the environment, making sure that you're not doing too much harm to the environment, because the reality is that whenever you remove any substance from the earth, you are going to create some displacement. That is a given, right? The question is how much displacement and the lasting impact on the displacement that you are going to create, right? And you have to strike a balance where that is concerned, right? So from my own view and my own run-ins with the authorities, dialogue to me in some instances are crucial in understanding the do's and don'ts of in particular the environment and the quarrying situation that has now faced the government. Quite frankly, I think the government is dealing with the matter the best way possible, right? They may not have all the answers at the moment, right? But they are going through the technocrats, and the technocrats will advise the government as to the best way forward. And you know, they have to do their job, and that is the reality.
All right, so Mr. Lang, I'd like your take on that, on this mining situation in Portobello, and if you think the government is prioritizing the economy over long term.
Well, in economics, you see, there's always economics is a lot of math and numbers and formulas, but there's always a input for the environment, because that is always a consideration in making decisions with respect to resources. That is one of the resources that is taken into consideration. And it doesn't matter the model, the economic model that you use, most of the time, not all, but 90% of the time, the model tells you to prioritize the environment over potential economic activity, because there's always a view to for the sustainability index, it is called, and the environment is a key part of that, because there's no economic activity without your environment. So when you weight it and put it in the model, it always comes up, and the environmentalists usually win. However, that is always, as we're discussing now, weighed against the political realities and the social realities, as is the case with most decisions that are made. because a lot of times the economic decision will tell you to do something that will have social or cause possible social unrest, but it is the right thing to do. And that is where the conflict comes in most times between economics and politics. Because personally, I don't believe, for example, true economists make good politicians, because the answers that the political model usually give, if you apply that directly to a society, for example, it does usually go well for your political career. So that is the kind of dilemma that is faced between politics and economics. But specifically to this case, I would agree with Simon that it's definitely dialogue that will do the trick, because there's definitely a need, especially now in our context where you have COVID. Mr. Chen mentioned the fall off with our economy in terms of it is the worst fall off we have had since ever, since this COVID pandemic has come upon us. So there is definitely a need in the eyes of the government to stimulate some economic activity to compensate for the loss in GDP that we have been suffering over the past 2 or 3 quarters. So definitely dialogue will have to be the talk of the town, balancing the interests of the environment and the environmentalists with the need for stimulated economic activity. And so far, if they keep the current stance, which is an open door kind of dialogue kind of stance, and setting clear boundaries as to what is acceptable and what is not, and allowing setting triggers, so you know when you go too far in terms of mining or whatever, so the government itself keeps itself in check. If that approach is taken, I think it will work for both sides.
All right. Thank you very much for that, Mr. Ling. You did mention earlier that economists do not necessarily make very good politicians, right?
True economics. Strictly by
True.
the
All right. My apologies. I have to be very specific. True economists. True economists. So there's a question here from the current chairman of Chancellor, Mr. Cadell Green. He made a question in the chat, and the question is: do you believe a shift in political structure could do us some good?
political structure as I don't understand. What does
Here's the question. I'm waiting a response from you.
Well, I would presume that in terms of, I guess, instead of the current political parties that have been present in Jamaica and the ideologies that these parties encapsulate, if there a shift in terms of a new direction, new ideologies would do us some good as opposed to what we currently have. And a third option person.
Well, if I could take a first stab at that, one thing that we could consider, because we've been running with the same system for a little while. Typically, 50 little bit percent vote for one party and 40 plenty for the other. The voter turnout has been getting lower and lower. So what you find is that the governing party is being elected by less than 1/4 of the electorate. So I'm wondering if it may, and many people have put this on the table, if we shouldn't be voting for our MPs kind of separate from the administration, right? From the political administration or the cabinet, and so that you probably would have a little better control there. Because what's happening is that even if you have now we have a pretty decent majority of 49 to 14 or whatever it is, right? But when it was like 32 to 31, as close as it was, you don't have enough influence from the opposition as you could to make for the more inclusive arrangements that the guys who wrote Why Nations Fail recommend. So we have to keep examining the structures to say, boy, how could we have more voices at the table of decision making? I don't have the answers to it, but some people have put on the table separating the election of the MP from those of the Prime Minister and the people who form the cabinet.
I want to take up Courtney's point as I have some direct experience in that area. That was the founding principle of the NDM, the National Democratic Movement, when it was formed in it was launched in 1995 and had its first conference in 1996 under the leadership of Bruce Golding. And if we go back to 2002, when Bruce Golding entered the Jamaica Labour Party, there was a memorandum of understanding that allowed him to go back into the Labour Party because some of these principles, while not enacted 100%, would then become a part of the Labour Party's, I would put it as ideology, but as their platform. And this is what led ultimately to the opposition chairing the parliamentary committees. Right. The way that you have pointed out, and in at least two instances, it has been very effective in bringing the opposition into the decision-making process, where the opposition chairs the PAC, the Public Affairs Committee, and the PAAC. It's a tweak of the Westminster system, and the point I made earlier is that Jamaica inherited a system in 1962 from the British, where you have a parliamentary democracy. But what we tend to forget is that you also have in the Westminster system something known as Whitehall, which is I wouldn't say unchanging, but a professional civil service that is not easily subject to political manipulation. Let's put it in those terms. For many reasons that I would take another whole evening to discuss, that was over time eroded. The independence of the civil service was eroded. Ministers went from being board chairmen to being chief executives, aided and abetted by the voters and aided and abetted by the press. The media and the public commentators who ought to know better destroyed the system without realizing they were destroying a system out of impatience. And that is summarizing 60 years of history in 2 sentences. But what they say, horses for courses. Jamaica now has 58 years of, probably more, I've lost count, maybe Mr. Lenka helped me with the adding, but 58 years of experience as an independent country. And we have evolved our own institutions to respond to our own conditions. But the danger always is that it takes decades to build institutions and understanding around institutions. And it takes a rash political decision to destroy it in a day that you don't build back. So we have built over time through hard grit and experience, coming back to Courtney's comments about the weak regulatory framework in the early 1990s, when we did what would have ultimately been good, which is liberalize the economy. But we liberalized it at a time when the regulatory framework and the capacity to regulate was weak. And we must never ignore that you have a small and vulnerable economy and a small and vulnerable political directorate that is vulnerable to, I don't want to use that term as strong as hijack, but strong lobbying from special interests in this country. And special interest is not just like a rich man on the hill. It is whatever lobby group that decide that they can carve a piece of the political pie for themselves. It's the nature of politics. So we build institutions. It took us hundreds of lives and white tribalism to build an electoral advisory commission that is best in class. It took us a fiscal crisis and a meltdown like no other. In fact, the meltdown of the 90s, when I tell people the percentage of the GDP that it ultimately costs Jamaica, they think I'm kidding, because you would read in the headlines about Mexico, you read about Argentina, you read about some of the Eastern European countries, but none approach Jamaica in terms of the size of the meltdown. But Out of it came a strong central bank. Out of it has come epoch. Out of it has come many things. But it took a crisis to get us there. It took us a crisis in electricity price and capacity to get us where we are now. And it has taken a crisis. Jamaica, for the last 20 years, has been consistently, if you were to average it over the 20 years, has been the most homicidal country in the world. And it has taken that crisis to get us to a consensus on crime. So what is the answer to the question? The answer is we inherited a particular political model. We have modified it and adapted it to the reality of Jamaica. What has not been adopted and to my mind, realized is the understanding of the electorate. We have arrived here, and if I was to go and poll, even at UWI or even Chancellor Hall, and say, how did we come out of the fiscal crisis we were in 10 years ago? You get out, you just hear epoch, but nobody knows how epoch came about. It did not, I mean, Courtney was probably closer in the decision making around the time when JDX and Index was debated. It was not done daily. There was debate because it required everybody to give up something.
Absolutely.
When people said the public sector saw the greatest division in their real wages over the years, the public sector had to hug up no real wage increases for almost a decade. Financial pensioners had to give up the little earnings they get on their investment. Banks had to give up their on their balance sheet returns on government paper, and on and on. A lot of people had to sacrifice, but it didn't come about by accident. There was a lot of horse trading and a lot of calls and a lot of meetings and a lot of people saying, boy, for the national, we have to do something. I was reminding one of the leaders the other day that he had called me back in 2000, called to beg to talk. If people call people and come and say, look, man, talk to this man because I hear that in being stubborn, or call that one and talk to this one. Or you call, but you don't know some of the calls that were being made at the time. Yeah. In fact, twice because after the first one wasn't sufficient, I had to go back a second. It was some hard calls, And you must remember too that you had the IMF breathing down your neck, World Bank breathing down your neck, IDB breathing down your neck, and saying, what you are asking your people to hug up is foolishness. Take the haircut now. Why? Finzac, sorry, I don't even like to use the term Finzac because Finzac has gotten a very bad name. A second financial sector crisis, but their remedy, and I was assured by somebody who sat in my own house right here in Mandeville and said 2/3 of her colleagues believe that Jamaica should just bite the bullet, clean it up in 2 years and reset the clock. This foolishness about trying to work your way down from 140 something percent to 96% in X years. Nobody has ever done it. No country has ever done it. There was no precedent, and Jamaica was not exactly going to be any sort of bastion of confidence. Because look at Jamaica's track record up to then. What would have given anybody confidence in 2012 that Jamaica could do it? But we did it. But if you went out to the street and said, how did we do it? 99% of the people couldn't. They go out and they blind vote one way or the other. They don't understand what they're voting for in terms of what really worked in terms of getting us out of the chasm.
True. And if I could just add, that is one of the things that we definitely need more of, and Sir Campbell had touched it earlier, participation of especially young people in holding the political institution accountable. Definitely it starts with awareness and understanding of the history of our economy and the decisions that were made, and definitely holding whether it's a member of parliament, the prime minister, accountable for decisions and policies that they have. And I think definitely we have an opportunity now more than ever to get that done. I mean, COVID has its bad, but definitely it has highlighted the need for example, the digital sphere, development of the digital sphere, and persons being more plugged into the digital sphere. And because of that, persons are automatically now more aware in 2020 than they would have been in, say, 1996. So definitely we need to take advantage of that, especially the younger generation. And as you would have rightfully said earlier, Mr. Campbell, your generation is definitely passing the baton to the younger generation. So definitely we need to inform ourselves better, and social media and the digital platforms that come with it definitely is a vehicle for that information to be accessed. We see that's definitely where politics is going for sure. You see, in the last election, for example, there couldn't be no mass gatherings and the traditional, motorcades and so forth. So most of the election was definitely online, digital,
On social media.
and on social media. So definitely that's where everything is going. So now we definitely have an opportunity to inform ourselves, firstly, one, and then hold the government and those set in charge of policy accountable for the things that they say they will do and have not done, or the things that they should do. And that will go a far way, I believe, in strengthening our democracy and increasing participation. And overall, I hope, it is my dream that it will lead to a much stronger and better Jamaica, not only economically but socially, as well as we develop.
Let me also say that,
All right.
we're speaking a lot about youth and so on and passing the baton. Um, when I go and speak to various youth forums and so on, one thing that I encourage them to do is to do some research, look at your history and so on. Figure out what is important to you as it relates to your country, the direction that you want your country to go, whether it be in healthcare, crime, economy, whatever, right? Do some research on it. Um, get yourself active in some way or the other, right? And try to chart a way forward, right? Try
Yeah,
to
man,
get
take an
involved in different
interest.
groups and help out, because there's no sense in the youth sitting down and not being involved, because I know a lot of persons don't a lot of young people rather don't like to get involved in politics for many different reasons, right? But the reality is, without young persons like myself and others getting into politics, getting involved and taking on some challenges, then we won't change the landscape, and we would just repeating ourselves. So I think it is important for all of us to encourage young persons to pick something in life, in terms of an area, and chart a course, chart a way forward as it relates to that.
All right. Thank you very much for that point, Mr. Songster. And thank you for closing the the question earlier on that was posed to the panel, Mr. Link. So the final question from a member of the audience, and I'm here reading it right now. It's a very controversial question, and very, very controversial. So I'm posing it to the entire panel. You can start discussing it from now. Do you think Jamaica is on the brink of becoming a modern day colony of China? I mean, I'm an IR student, and this is a major topic, major topic in a part of my degree, very major, and a lot of research has been done on the global footprint that has been set and made by China, and only since recently, because they have been setting their standard high and leveling up the game now since recently, but they have been around for quite some time now, not only within Jamaica but across the Caribbean and the world. So I mean, what are your views? What are your perspectives on this? Is it
Firstly,
possible? Are there any pros and cons?
Jamaica is not going to become a colony of China, and it's nowhere near being a colony of China. Jamaica's overall public debt is less than to China. I mean, the debt to China is less than, I think, 3% or 4% of the overall public debt. In terms of the ownership of the national assets, I don't think it's even reached 1%. So A lot of it, I think, is driven by xenophobia. Not to say that we must be naive and not understand Super 4 games that are being played, because thousands of Jamaicans have died in Super 4 games in the past. The fact is, though, that being in the backyard of the United States, and if you go back to the time of the Monroe Doctrine, America considers everything that happens in this hemisphere America's business. And if for those who are paying attention, you will see that shots have already been fired, statements have already been made as to where we are and who we must stand with. Jamaica has tried in the past to forge a non-aligned path, and it has come with a cost. But on the other side of the coin, the Chinese, yes, China, and this is something that the Chinese, they feel, and the reality is that China was the preeminent world power up until maybe 700 or 800 years ago, when it was surpassed by. The prediction is that in some measures, China is already the biggest economy in the world, but certainly by 2050, China will be the biggest economy in the world. And hand in hand with being the biggest economy in the world, it is now growing its military strength. But its military strength is not interested in the Caribbean or interested in this part of the world, because they already see that this is America's natural sphere of interest. China's sphere of interest is Asia, Southeast Asia in particular, the China Sea, and they will confront America as the other superpower in the China Sea. They are not going to confront America in the Caribbean. That's it. Chinese are business people. They have an economy to run. For all intents and purposes, Jamaica historically has been the world's largest producer of bauxite. We have been surpassed for reasons we could spend a whole lot of evening discussing. The Chinese have shown some interest, not a lot of interest, as people would think, in Jamaican raw materials. But the fact is that they can get bauxite from Guinea, they can get bauxite from the Australians who are anxious to trade with China and has publicly cut its natural allegiance with Europe and said they are an Asian country. Look at China's Australian policy statements over many years. There's bauxite in several African countries, there's bauxite in India. So Chinese don't have to have Jamaican bauxite. And if you look, the Chinese companies that have invested in bauxite, aluminum, and Jamaica, they have not exactly been rushing to restart. They have their own challenges and their own issues. If you look at what has happened at Maine, St. Elizabeth. So the Chinese are feeling that we are wrong, but their interest is essentially economic. They are the world's largest producer of manufactured goods, and whether we like China or don't like China, they're going to end up buying Chinese goods. They are the world's largest importer, or will be the world's largest importer of raw materials. So if you want a market for your raw materials, trust me, you're selling to China. Now, whether China, there's any danger of China setting up a military base here or trying to exert some sort of influence on Jamaica, apart from an economic influence, I'm not worried about it. I don't remember who it was that said that. I think it was Errol Barrow, the Barbadian statesman, who said, "Friends of all, enemies of none." That is Jamaica's proper stance. And if China is the biggest and most powerful country in the world, how can we not be trading with China? How can we not be having exchanges with China? And China, the scholarships, China has over 2 million foreign students studying in China from developing countries. There are, I don't know, I was surprised when I came across some medical students from St. Elizabeth. Every year, maybe 60 students between Mount Monroe, Hampton, and some other schools in St. Elizabeth go to medical school in China, just to give an example. But they have been doing this for a long time. So if that is colonization, what can I say?
Mr. Chen is modern day colonization, where it's not in the traditional sense where you occupy physically, but you occupy based on your economic interests. I think Jove, no, so the IR, who studies IR? Would elaborate on that.
But I studied IR,
Okay.
Joseph Saxon. Yeah.
Right. So you could probably elaborate on that. So I think that's more the perspective that they're coming from with that question. But if you ask me, I would say no. Whether traditional view or modern day colonization view, I would say no. but definitely that narrative comes about because of the superpower interests between the United States and China. So definitely that narrative would be created because clearly, as Sachin said, we are in the United States backyard as a superpower, and China as a emerging, well, not even not emerging, they are a world power now, and has been for some time. Clearly, want to flex their muscle and show their worth, and they have been doing that successfully across territories, and the United States themselves have a huge debt um, to China that they have to service as well. So it's all in the nature and the game of international relations. But in Jamaica's perspective, I don't think we are there yet where we have to be worried about that. I mean, 3.9% of our debt is owed to China. That is not significant if you ask me. And if we are to grow as a developing country, partnership is important, and not only partnership with the United States of America, who over the years have been showing by their actions less and less input, certainly economic input in the Caribbean
Jamaica.
and Jamaica for sure. So definitely we have to look for ourselves and fix ourselves as much as United States are. And if China is one of those partners that are willing to help us to develop, certainly in the area of infrastructure, they have been doing that, then why not? So I don't think we're there yet, and I don't think we'll be there, but it is certainly something to observe.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Chen and Mr. Leng. I'm assuming there is no comments from neither Mr. Sangston or Mr. Campbell. So we'll be moving on to the closing of the forum, and the vote of thanks will be done by the Vice President of the Current Affairs Club of Chancellor Hall, Mr. Ajir Cunningham. So he'll be here with us in a moment.
You hear me?
Yes, we're hearing you.
Yeah, man,
Good night.
Ajir, we're hearing you.
Whoa, was a brilliant conversation from the panel, Mr. Chin, Mr. Ling, Mr. Campbell, and Mr. Songster. Well done. Truly appreciate it. The seasoned knowledge from all of you. And we're very grateful. And just like to say thank you again. We'd love to have you for some other conversations sometime in the future. It's very excellent, man. Thank you. Oh, and a special big up to Dynamite, man. One Dynamite.
All right.
You're from Dynamite, Mr. Campbell?
Yes, sir.
Oh, so am I.
Yes. One and one.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Mr. Campbell. All right, everybody, take care of yourselves.
Again, thank you. Really learned a lot from this presentation tonight. So thank you, everybody, and thank you for making yourself available and making it